What if Taiwan was cut off from the world overnight? No food, no fuel, no trade, no escape. It sounds extreme, but China has a five-step master plan to achieve this, without launching a single missile. In recent years, China's military pressure has stoked fears of an invasion. Chinese warships and aircraft now operate around Taiwan nearly every day. However, as a major power with substantial diplomatic, economic, and military clout, Beijing has a range of options to take control of the island without needing to invade it. Taiwan is an economic powerhouse, but it has a critical weakness. It's heavily dependent on trade. In 2022, Taiwan's imports and exports accounted for 61% and 69% of its GDP, respectively. Only the Netherlands has a more trade-driven economy. By comparison, China's imports and exports only represent 15% and 20% of its GDP. Taiwan's survival depends on global shipping routes. Unlike Ukraine, which can be resupplied through land borders, Taiwan is an island. If those sea lanes are blocked, Taiwan becomes completely isolated. If Beijing manages to cut Taiwan's trade by just 50%, the damage would be catastrophic. Manufacturing would slow, supply chains would break, and the economy could collapse. Taiwan imports an astonishing 97% of its energy, one of the highest rates in the world. In terms of composition, 44% comes from oil, 29% from coal, and 20% from natural gas. Shockingly, Taiwan's energy stockpiles are dangerously low. It has only 5 months of crude oil reserves, 1 month of coal, and less than 2 weeks of natural gas. If shipments stop, Taiwan's power plants will begin shutting down. With power outages, industries would grind to a halt, hospitals would lose power, and panic would ensue. Even more alarming, China wouldn't need a military blockade to enforce this. It could simply deny tankers entry under a customs inspection pretense, allowing Taiwan's fuel supply to dwindle. If power outages are dire, imagine the implications of food shortages. Taiwan imports 70% of its food, and its reliance has grown as diets have diversified. If imports were cut off, Taiwan's food stockpiles would last about 12 months. In contrast to landlocked nations, Taiwan has no borders to fall back on. It would be entirely at the mercy of its sea routes. If those shut down, starvation isn't just a possibility, it's a guarantee. Chinese policymakers recognize Taiwan's vulnerabilities. In 2006, a textbook from China's National Defense University proposed surrounding Taiwan with naval and air forces to sever its economic and military connections with the outside world. This strategy involves a blockade designed to cut off trade, energy, and essential resources. If China could inflict enough pain on Taiwan for a prolonged period, it might force the Taiwanese to capitulate. A nation cut off from the sea is gasping for air. Suppose an incident were to occur in the Taiwan Strait. Beijing could instigate a gray zone blockade under the pretense of a humanitarian or law enforcement mission, establishing a quarantine zone around Taiwan. This would serve to coerce companies and governments to comply with China's terms, undermining Taiwan's sovereignty claims. Unlike an invasion, a gray zone blockade would not necessarily be seen as an act of war. If the Chinese Coast Guard leads the mission instead of its Navy, it would complicate military intervention by the U.S. and its allies. The Chinese Coast Guard would announce customs inspections for all cargo and tanker vessels entering Taiwan. They would be authorized to board ships, conduct inspections, and question personnel. Non-compliant companies would risk losing market access. On the surface, this approach would appear innocent. Just file the appropriate paperwork, and Taiwan is open for business. However, complying would effectively mean Taiwan loses its sovereignty, slipping into a state of submission. China wouldn't even need to seal off the entire island. Cutting Taiwan's trade by just 50% could have dire consequences, especially if China stops all imports of oil, gas, and coal, leading to widespread power failures. Taiwan has limited deep-water ports, and Chinese forces would target these first. For instance, Kaohsiung, Taiwan's busiest port, handled about $159 billion worth of trade in 2022, accounting for 57% of its maritime trade. If China were to impose a blockade, it would patrol nearby waters and stop vessels that do not comply with the new customs regime. The bulk of the Coast Guard would focus on Kaohsiung, likely entering Taiwan's 24 nautical mile contiguous zone while avoiding the 12 nautical mile territorial seas. While the Chinese Navy would take a back seat in the blockade, they would still deploy carrier battle groups and surface action groups to the corners of the island. This naval deployment would involve ships trained specifically for this scenario. As Chinese naval and air forces continuously fly sorties of manned and unmanned aircraft around Taiwan, the goal would be to intimidate Taiwanese forces and deter foreign intervention. Should Taiwan respond to the blockade with force, it would provide China with a pretext to escalate tensions, potentially opening the door to full-scale war. In addition to conventional tactics, China could conduct cyber attacks targeting Taiwanese communications and financial systems to further isolate the island. These efforts would coincide with a misinformation campaign designed to incite public unrest against Taiwan's government. Controlling information flow would allow for a more prolonged blockade. Taiwan relies on more than a dozen undersea cables for its internet service, and China could disrupt these lines, leaving the island in the dark. For Beijing, a blockade would be preferable to war, even if it introduces greater uncertainty about how the international community would respond. However, Taiwan's resilience could complicate China's plans. If Taiwan receives assistance from the United States or other allies, Beijing might struggle to force the island into capitulation. The situation remains precarious. The blockade could escalate into an invasion, leading to unpredictable consequences. So, as we consider these scenarios, we must ask ourselves, will China actually go through with this plan? Will Taiwan be able to withstand the pressure? How would the world react if Beijing made its move? The situation in the Taiwan Strait is not just a regional issue, it's a global one. The implications of a potential conflict could reverberate worldwide, affecting global trade and international relations. If you approve of what we do, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and share this video. Thank you for your time.